Get summat and wrap that up for her, he said to Tilly, looking at the butter on the table. And taking a clean knife, he cut off that side of the butter where it was touched. His speech, the for her, penetrated slowly into the foreign woman and angered Tilly. Vicar has the butter fra Brown's by rights, said the insuppressible servant woman. Well, I'll be churning tomorrow morning first thing. Yes, the long-drawn foreign yes, yes, said the Polish woman. I went to Mrs. Brown's. She hasn't any more. Tilly bridled her head, bursting to say that, according to the etiquette of people who bought butter, it was no sort of manners whatever coming to a place cool as you like and knocking at the front door asking for a pound as a stopgap while your other people were short. If you go to Brown's, you go to Brown's, and buy butter isn't just to make shift when Brown's has got none. Brangwyn understood perfectly this unspoken speech of Tilly's. The Polish lady did not. And as she wanted butter for the vicar, and as Tilly was churning in the morning, she waited. Slither up now, said Brangwyn loudly, after this silence, and resolved itself out. Tilly disappeared through the inner door. I'm afraid that I should not come so, said the stranger, looking at him inquiringly, as if referring to him for what it was usual to do. He felt confused. How's that? He said, trying to be genial and being only protective. Do you... she began deliberately, but she was not sure of her ground, and the conversation came to an end. Her eyes looked at him all the while, because she could not speak the language. They stood facing each other. The dog walked away from her to him. He bent down to it. And how's your little girl? He asked. Yes, thank you. She is very well, was the reply, a phrase of polite speech in a foreign language merely. Sit you down, he said, and she sat in a chair, her slim arms coming through the slits of her cloak resting on her lap. You're not used to these parts, he said, still standing on the hearthrug, with his back to the fire, coatless, looking with curious directness at the woman. Her self-possession pleased him and inspired him, set him curiously free. It seemed to him almost brutal to feel so master of himself and of the situation. Her eyes rested on him for a moment, questioning as she thought of the meaning of his speech. No, she said, understanding. No, it is strange. You find it middling rough, he said. Her eyes waited on him, so that he should say it again. Hours are rough to you, he repeated. Yes, yes, I understand. Yes, it is different. It is strange. But I was in Yorkshire. Oh, well then, he said, it's no worse here than what they are up there. She did not quite understand. His protective manner and his sureness and his intimacy puzzled her. What did he mean? If he was her equal, why did he behave so without formality? No, she said, vaguely, her eyes resting on him. She saw him fresh and naive, uncouth, almost entirely beyond relationship with her. Yet he was good-looking, with his fair hair and blue eyes full of energy, and with his healthy body that seemed to take equality with her. She watched him steadily. He was difficult for her to understand, warm, uncouth, and confident as he was, sure on his feet, as if he did not know what it was to be unsure. And then, was it that gave him what then was it that gave him this curious stability? She did not know. She wondered. She looked round the room he lived in. It had a close intimacy that fascinated and almost frightened her. The furniture was old and familiar as old people, and the whole place seemed to so kin to him, as if it partook of his being, that she was uneasy. "It is already a long time that you have lived in this house, yes?" she asked. "I've always lived here," he said. "Yes, but your people, your family?" "We've been here above 200 years," he said. Her eyes were on him all the time, wide open and trying to grasp him. He felt that he was there for her. "It is your own place? The house? The farm?" "Yes," he said. He looked down at her and met her look. It disturbed her. She did not know him. He was a foreigner. They had nothing to do with each other. Yet his look disturbed her to knowledge of him. He was so strangely confident and direct. "You live quite alone?" "Yes, if you call it alone." She did not understand. It seemed unusual to her. What was the meaning of it? And whenever her eyes, after watching him for some time, inevitably met his, she was aware of a heat beating up over her consciousness. She sat motionless and in conflict. Who was this strange man who was at once so near to her? What was happening to her? Something in his young, warm, thinking eyes seemed to assume a right to her, to speak to her, to extend her his protection. But how? Why did he speak to her? Why were his eyes so certain, so full of light and confident, waiting for no permission nor signal? Tilly returned with a large leaf and found the two silent. At once he felt it incumbent on him to speak, now the serving woman had come back. "How old is your little girl?" he asked. 4 years, she replied. "Her father hasn't been dead long, then?" he asked. "She was 1 year when he died." 3 years? "Yes, 3 years that he is dead, yes." Curiously quiet she was, almost abstracted, answering these questions. She looked at him again, and with some maidenhood opening in her eyes. He felt he would not move, neither towards her nor away from her. Something about her presence hurt him till he was almost rigid before her. He saw the girl's wondering look rise in her eyes. Tilly handed her the butter, and she rose. "Thank you very much," she said. "How much is it?" "We'll make the vicar a present of it," he said. "It'll do for me going to church." "It'll look better of you, if you went to church and took the money for your butter," said Tilly, persistent in her claim to him. "You'd have to put it in, shouldn't you?" he said. "How much, please?" said the Polish woman to Tilly. Brangwen stood by and let be. Then thank you very much, she said. Bring your little girl down sometime to look at the fowls and horses, he said, if she'd like it. Yes, she would like it, said the stranger. And she went. Brangwyn stood dimmed by her departure. He could not notice Tilly, who was looking at him uneasily, wanting to be reassured. He could not think of anything. He felt that he had made some invisible connection with the strange woman. A daze had come over his mind. He had another center of consciousness. In his breast, or in his bowels, somewhere in his body, there had started another activity. It was as if a strong light were burning there, and he was blind within it, unable to know anything except that this transfiguration burned between him and her, connecting them like a secret power. Since she had come to the house, he went about in a daze, scarcely seeing even the things he handled, drifting, quiescent, in a state of metamorphosis. He submitted to that which was happening to him, letting go his will, suffering the loss of himself, dormant, always on the brink of ecstasy, like a creature evolving to a new birth. She came twice with her child to the farm, but there was this lull between them, an intense calm and passivity, like a torpor upon them, so that there was no active change took place. He was almost unaware of the child, yet by his native good humor he gained her confidence, even her affection, setting her on the horse to ride, giving her corn for the fowls. Once he drove the mother and child from Ilkeston, picking them up on the road. The child huddled close to him, as if for love. The mother sat very still. There was a vagueness, like a soft mist, over all of them, and a silence, as if their wills were suspended. Only he saw her hands ungloved folded in her lap, and he noticed the wedding ring on her finger. It excluded him. It was a closed circle. It bound her life. The wedding ring, it stood for her life, in which he could have no part. Nevertheless, beyond all this, there was herself and himself, which should meet. As he helped her down from the trap, almost lifting her, he felt he had some right to take her thus between his hands. She belonged as yet to that other, to that which was behind, but he must care for her also. She was too living to be neglected. Sometimes her vagueness, in which he was lost, made him angry, made him rage, but he told himself still as yet. She had no response, no being towards him. It puzzled and enraged him, but he submitted for a long time. Then, from the accumulated troubling of her ignoring him, gradually a fury broke out, destructive, and he wanted to go away, to escape her. It happened. She came down to the marsh with the child, whilst he was in this state. Then he stood over against her, strong and heavy in his revolt, and though he said nothing, still he felt his anger and heavy impatience grip hold of her. She was shaken again, as out of a torpor. Again her heart stirred with a quick outrunning impulse. She looked at him, at the stranger, who was not a gentleman, yet who insisted on coming into her life, and the pain of a new birth in herself strung all her veins to a new form. She would have to begin again, to find a new being, a new form, to respond to that blind, insistent figure standing over against her. A shiver of sickness, of new birth passed over her. The flame leaped up him under his skin. She wanted it, this new life from him, with him, yet she must defend herself against it, for it was a destruction. As he worked alone on the land, or sat up with his ewes at lambing time, the facts and material of his daily life fell away, leaving the kernel of his purpose clean. And then it came upon him that he would marry her and she would be his life. Gradually, even without seeing her, he came to know her. He would have liked to think of her as something given into his protection, like a child without parents, but it was forbidden him. He had to come down from this pleasant view of the case. She might refuse him, and besides, he was afraid of her. But during the long February nights, with the ewes in labor, looking out from the shelter into the flashing stars, he knew he did not belong to himself. He must admit that he was only fragmentary, something incomplete and subject. There were the stars in the dark heaven, traveling, the whole host passing by on some eternal voyage. So he sat small and submissive to the greater ordering. Unless she would come to him, he must remain as a nothingness. It was a hard experience, but after her repeated obliviousness to him, after he had seen so often that he did not exist for her, after he had raged and tried to escape, and said he was good enough by himself, he was a man and could stand alone. He must, in the starry multiplicity of the night, humble himself, and admit and know that without her he was nothing. He was nothing, but with her he would be real. If she were now walking across the frosty grass near the sheep shelter, through the fretful bleating of the ewes and lambs, she would bring him completeness and perfection. And if it would be so, that she should come to him, it should be so. It was ordained so. He was a long time resolving definitely to ask her to marry him, and he knew, if he asked her, she must really acquiesce. She must, it could not be otherwise. He had learned a little of her. She was poor, quite alone, and had had a hard time in London, both before and after her husband died. But in Poland she was a lady well born, a landowner's daughter. All these things were only words to him. The fact of her superior birth, the fact that her husband had been a brilliant doctor, the fact that he himself was her inferior in almost every way of distinction. There was an inner reality, a logic of the soul, which connected her with him. One evening in March, when the wind was roaring outside, came the moment to ask her. He had sat with his hands before him, leaning to the fire, and as he watched the fire, he knew almost without thinking that he was going this evening. "Have you got a clean shirt?" he asked Tilly. "You know you've got clean shirts," she said. "Aye, bring me a white one." Tilly brought one down of the linen shirts he had inherited from his father, putting it before him to air at the fire. She loved him with a dumb, aching love, as he sat leaning with his arms on his knees, still and absorbed, unaware of her. Lately a quivering inclination to cry had come over her, when she did anything for him in his presence. Now her hands trembled, as she spread the shirt. He was never shouting and teasing now. The deep stillness there was in the house made her tremble. He went to wash himself. Queer little breaks of consciousness seemed to rise and burst like bubbles out of the depth of his stillness. "It's got to be done," he said as he stooped to take the shirt out of the fender. "It's got to be done, so why bulk it?" And as he combed his hair before the mirror on the wall, he retorted to himself superficially, "The woman's not speechless dumb. She's not cluttering at the nipple. She's got the right to please herself and displease whoever she likes." This streak of common sense carried him a little further. "Did you want anything?" asked Tilly, suddenly appearing, having heard him speak. She stood watching him comb his fair beard. His eyes were calm and uninterrupted. "Aye," he said. "Where have you put the scissors?" She brought them to him and stood watching as, chin forward, he trimmed his beard. "Don't go and crop yourself as if you was at a shearing contest," she said anxiously. He blew the fine curled hair quickly off his lips. He put on all clean clothes, folded his stock carefully, and donned his best coat. Then, being ready as grey twilight was falling, he went across to the orchard to gather the daffodils. The wind was roaring in the apple trees. The yellow flowers swayed violently up and down. He heard even the fine whisper of their spears as he stooped to break the flattened, brittle stems of the flowers. "What's to do?" shouted a friend who met him as he left the garden gate. "Bit of courting, like," said Brangwen. And Tilly, in a great state of trepidation and excitement, let the wind whisk her over the field to the big gate, whence she could watch him go. He went up the hill and on towards the vicarage, the wind roaring through the hedges, whilst he tried to shelter his bunch of daffodils by his side. He did not think of anything, only knew that the wind was blowing. Night was falling, the bare trees drummed and whistled. The vicar, he knew, would be in his study, the Polish woman in the kitchen, a comfortable room with her child. In the darkest of twilight, he went through the gate and down the path where a few daffodils stooped in the wind, and shattered crocuses made a pale, colourless ravel. There was a light streaming on to the bushes at the back from the kitchen window. He began to hesitate. How could he do this? Looking through the window, he saw her seated in the rocking chair with the child, already in its nightdress, sitting on her knee. The fair head, with its wild, fierce hair, was drooping forwards towards the fire warmth which reflected on the bright cheeks and clear skin of the child, who seemed to be musing, almost like a grown-up person. The mother's face was dark and still, and she saw with a pang that she was away back in the life that had been. The child's hair gleamed like spun glass. Her face was illuminated, till it seemed like wax lit up from the inside. The wind boomed strongly. Mother and child sat motionless, silent, the child staring with vacant dark eyes into the fire, the mother looking into space. The little girl was almost asleep. It was her will which kept her eyes so wide. Suddenly she looked round, troubled as the wind shook the house, and Brangwen saw the small lips move. The mother began to rock. He heard the slight crunch of the rockers of the chair. Then he heard the low, monotonous murmur of a song in a foreign language. Then a great
burst of wind, the mother seemed to have drifted away. The child's eyes were black and dilated. Brangwen looked up at the clouds which packed in great, alarming haste across the dark sky. Then there came the child's high, complaining, yet imperceptive. Then there came the child's high, complaining, yet imperative voice. "Don't sing that stuff, Mother. I don't want to hear it." The singing died away. "You will go to bed," said Mother. He saw the clinging protest of the child, the unmoved farawayness of the mother, the clinging, grasping effort of the child. Then suddenly the clear, childish challenge. "I want you to tell me a story." The wind blew. The story began. The child nestled against the mother. Brangwen waited outside, suspended, looking at the wild waving of the trees in the wind and the gathering darkness. He had his fate to follow. He lingered here at the threshold. The child crouched distinct and motionless, curled in against her mother, the eyes dark and unblinking among the keen wisp of hair, like a curled up animal asleep. But for the eyes, the mother sat as if in shadow. The story went on as if by itself. Brangwen stood outside, seeing the night fall. He did not notice the passage of time. The hand that held the daffodils was fixed and cold. The story came to an end. The mother rose at last, with the child clinging round her neck. She must be strong to carry so large a child so easily. The little Anna clung round her mother's neck. The fair, strange face of the child looked over the shoulder of the mother, all asleep, but the eyes, and these wide and dark, kept up the resistance and the fight with something unseen. When they were gone, Brangwen stirred for the first time from the place where he stood, and looked round at the night. He wished it were really as beautiful and familiar as it seemed in these moments of release. Along with the child, he felt a curious strain on him, a suffering, like a fate. The mother came down again and began folding the child's clothes. He knocked. She opened, wondering, a little bit at bay, like a foreigner, uneasy. "Good evening," he said. "I'll just come in a minute." A change went quickly over her face. She was unprepared. She looked down at him as he stood in the light from the window, holding the daffodils, the darkness behind. In his black clothes, she again did not know him. She was almost afraid. But he was already stepping on to the threshold and closing the door behind him. She turned into the kitchen, startled out of herself by this invasion from the night. He took off his hat and came towards her. Then he stood in the light in his black clothes and his black stock hat in one hand and yellow flowers in the other. She stood away. At his mercy, snatched out of herself. She did not know him, only she knew he was a man come for her. She could only see the dark-clad man's figure standing there upon her, and the gripped fist of flowers. She could not see the face and the living eyes. He was watching her, without knowing her, only aware underneath of her presence. "I come to have a word with you," he said, striding forward to the table, laying down his hat and the flowers, which tumbled apart and lay in a loose heap. She had flinched from his advance. She had no will, no being. The wind boomed in the chimney, and he waited. He had disembarrassed his hands. Now he shut his fist. He was aware of her standing there, unknown, dread, yet related to him. "I came up," he said, speaking curiously matter of fact and level, "to ask if you'd marry me. You are free, aren't you?" There was a silence, whilst his blue eyes, strangely impersonal, looked into her eyes to seek an answer to the truth. He was looking for the truth out of her, and she, as if hypnotized, must answer at length. "Yes, I am free to marry." The expression of his eyes changed, became less impersonal, as if he were looking almost at her for the truth of her. Steady and intent and eternal they were, as if they would never change. They seemed to fix and to resolve her. She quivered, feeling herself created, will less lapsing into him, into a common will with him. "You want me?" she said. A pallor came over his face. "Yes," he said. Still there was suspense and silence. "No," she said, not of herself. "No, I don't know." He felt the tension breaking up in him, his fists slackened. He was unable to move. He stood looking at her, helpless in his vague collapse. For the moment, she had become unreal to him. Then he saw her come to him, curiously direct and as if without movement, in a sudden flow. She put her hand to his coat. "Yes, I want to," she said, impersonally, looking at him with wide, candid, newly opened eyes, opened now with supreme truth. He went very white as he stood, and did not move. Only his eyes were held by hers, and he suffered. She seemed to see him with her newly opened wide eyes, almost of a child, and with a strange movement that was agony to him. She reached slowly forward, her dark face and her breast to him, with a slow insinuation of a kiss that made something break in his brain, and it was darkness over him for a few moments. He had her in his arms, and, obliterated, was kissing her, and it was sheer, blenched agony to him to break away from himself. She was there so small and light and accepting in his arms like a child, and yet with such an insinuation of embrace, of infinite embrace, that he could not bear it, he could not stand. He turned and looked for a chair, and keeping her still in his arms, sat down with her close to him, to his breast. Then for a few seconds he went utterly to sleep. Asleep, and sealed in the darkest sleep, utter extreme oblivion, from which he came to gradually, always holding her warm and close upon him, and he was utterly silent as she was utterly silent as he, involved in the same oblivion, the fecund darkness. He returned gradually, but newly created, as after a gestation, a new birth, in the womb of darkness. Then she looked up at him, the wide young eyes blazing with light, and he bent down and kissed her on the lips. And the dawn blazed in them. Their new life came to pass. It was beyond all conceiving good. It was so good, and it was almost like a passing away, a trespass. He drew her suddenly closer to him. For soon the light began to fade in her. Gradually, as she was in his arms, her head sank. She leaned it against him, and lay still, with sunk head, a little tired, effaced because she was tired. And in her tiredness was a certain negation of him. "There is the child," she said, out of the long silence. He did not understand. It was a long time since he had heard a voice. Now also he heard the wind roaring, as if it had just begun again. "Yes," he said, not understanding. There was a slight contraction of pain at his heart, a slight tension on his brows, something he wanted to grasp and could not. "You will love her?" she said. The quick contraction, like pain, went over him again. "I love her now," he said. She lay still against him, taking his physical warmth without heed. It was great confirmation for him to feel her there, absorbing the warmth from him, giving him back her weight and her strange confidence. But where was she that she seemed so absent? His mind was open with wonder. He did not know her. "But I am much older than you," she said. "How old?" he asked. "I'm 34, she said. "I'm 28, he said. 6 years. She was oddly concerned, even as it pleased her a little. He sat and listened and wondered. It was rather splendid to be so ignored by her, whilst she lay against him, and he lifted her with his breathing, and felt her weight upon his living, so he had a completeness and an inviolable power. He did not interfere with her. He did not even know her. It was so strange that she lay there with her weight abandoned upon him. He was silent with delight. He felt strong, physically, carrying her on his breathing. The strange, inviolable completeness of the two of them made him feel as sure, as stable as God. Amused, he wondered what the vicar would say if he knew. "You needn't stop here much longer, housekeeping," he said. "I like it also here," she said. "When one has been in many places, it is very nice here." He was silent again at this. So close on him she lay. And yet she answered him from so far away. But he did not mind. "What was your own home like when you were little?" he asked. "My father was a landowner," she replied. "It was near a river." This did not convey much to him. All was as vague as before. But he did not care, while she was so close. "I am a landowner, a little one," he said. "Yes," she said. He had not dared to move. He sat there with his arms round her, her lying motionless on his breathing, and for a long time he did not stir. Then softly, timidly, his hand settled on the roundness of her arm, on the unknown. She seemed to lie a little closer. A hot flame licked up from his belly to his chest. But it was too soon. She rose and went across the room to a drawer, taking out a little tray cloth. There was something quiet and professional about her. She had been a nurse beside her husband both in Warsaw and in the rebellion afterwards. She proceeded to set a tray. It was as if she ignored Brangwen. He sat up, unable to bear the contradiction in her. She moved about inscrutably. Then, as he sat there, All mused and wondering, she came near to him, looking at him with wide gray eyes that almost smiled with a low light. But her ugly, beautiful mouth was still unmoved and sad. He was afraid. His eyes strained and roused with unusedness, quailed a little before her. He felt himself quailing, and yet he rose, as if obedient to her. He bent and kissed her heavy, sad, wide mouth, that was kissed and did not alter. Fear was too strong in him. Again he had not got her. She turned away. The vicarage kitchen was untidy, and yet to him beautiful with the untidiness of her and her child. Such a wonderful remoteness there was about her, and then something in touch with him that made his heart knock in his chest. He stood there and waited, suspended. Again she came to him, as he stood in his black clothes, with blue eyes very bright and puzzled for her, his face tensely alive, his hair disheveled. She came close up to him, to his intent, black clothed body, and laid her hand on his arm. He remained unmoved. Her eyes, with the blackness of memory, struggling with passion, primitive and electric, away at the back of them, rejected him and absorbed him at once. But he remained himself. He breathed with difficulty, and sweat came out at the roots of his hair on his forehead. "Do you want to marry me?" she asked slowly, always uncertain. He was afraid lest he could not speak. He drew breath hard, saying, "I do." Then again, what was agony to him, with one hand lightly resting on his arm, she leaned forward a little, and with a strange primeval suggestion of embrace, held him her mouth. It was ugly beautiful, and he could not bear it. He put his mouth on hers, and slowly, slowly the response came, gathering force and passion, till it seemed to him she was thundering at him, till he could bear no more. He drew away, white, unbreathing. Only in his blue eyes was something of himself concentrated, and in her eyes was a little smile upon a black void. She was drifting away from him again, and he wanted to go away. It was intolerable. He could bear no more. He must go, yet he was irresolute. But she turned away from him. With a little pang of anguish, of denial, it was decided. "I'll come back and speak to the vicar tomorrow," he said, taking his hat. She looked at him, her eyes expressionless and full of darkness. He could see no answer. "That'll do, won't it?" he said. "Yes," she answered, mere echo, without body or meaning. "Good night," he said. "Good night." He left her standing there, expressionless and void as she was. Then she went on laying the tray for the vicar, kneading the table. She put the daffodils aside on the dresser, without noticing them. Only their coolness, touching her hand, remained echoing there a long while. They were such strangers. They must forever be such strangers, that his passion was a clanging torment to him. Such intimacy of embrace, and such utter foreignness of contact. It was unbearable. He could not bear to be near her, and know the utter foreignness between them. Know how entirely they were strangers to each other. He went out into the wind. Big holes were blown into the sky. The moonlight blew out. Sometimes a high moon, liquid brilliant, scudded across the hollow space and took cover under electric brown iridescent cloud edges. Then there was a blot of cloud and shadow. Then somewhere in the night a radiance again, like a vapor. And all the sky was teeming and tearing along a vast disorder of flying shapes and darkness and raged fumes of light and a great brown circling halo. Then the terror of a moon running liquid brilliant into the open for a moment, hurting the eyes before she plunged under cover of cloud again.